Chapter 13. The fairies were in the midst of a hide-and-seek extravaganza. No one, not even the fairies themselves, knew how these things got started. Every few years, a little game snowballed into a giant fairy melee, and for a few weeks the sky above forever seethed with fairy flocks whirling from one spot to another in search of their hidden cousins. The other immortals had mixed feelings about this. Some loved the sight of the great cloud of fairies hovering and humming over the land. Others thought that the game was further evidence of the irresponsible nature of fairies. It's true that the fairies had no regard for others when they were in the midst of a game, and they would torpedo into bystanders without even an apology. Once, Licinius the centaur had been tormented nearly to madness by a fairy who insisted that there was a will-o'-the-wisp on his back. She would run up and down his spine, prying with her tiny fingers under each hair until he began to shriek. He caught her by the wings and held her hostage, demanding that the game come to an end. But he paid dearly for it. A vast swarm of fairies descended upon him with their wings flapping, and each fairy bit off one of his hairs until he was bald and shivering. Then they pelted him with cherries and laughed at him, and finally, when he gave up and released his hostage, they put a spell on him so his coat grew back purple. This, of course, had made him furious, and Nicholas had been forced to intervene before there was an all-out war between centaurs and fairies. This particular hide-and-seek extravaganza was different from previous games, because it was taking place inside the palace. Usually, the whole of forever was at the field, but this time the revels had erupted during the icy winter months, and the fairies have a horror of cold. Instead of calling the game, the Bouquet sisters had hospitably invited the extended fairy family to continue the fun at the palace, which, they assured their cousins, was plenty large enough for a rousing revel. With fairy blitheness, they neglected to inform Nicholas of their intentions, and the first hint to the household came when Melchior was knocked down the stairs by a sudden blow to the back. A team of fairies, in violent pursuit of another, swung out over his prone body while Nicholas, who had been discussing palace drainage a moment before, looked on in bewilderment. 14 fairies slipped down the banister, whooping and singing, and a third contingent swung happily on the chandelier that illuminated the great hall. Nicholas, with typical indulgence, permitted the game to continue. Once, McKenna, the eldest Bouquet and mistress of the revels, had begged Melchior's pardon with sincere remorse. Nicholas soon regretted his benevolence, though, for the game had been going on for 2 weeks and showed no signs of coming to an end. He himself had been knocked over twice, and, as Holly observed, that took some doing. 4 of Viviana's 5 sitting-room lamps had been broken. The glass case containing Nicholas's scepter was shattered, and all the house goblins were threatening to quit. They sidled through the halls, looking nervously over their shoulders and murmuring mutinously. The angrier they got, the bluer their skins grew. Melchior, his arm in a sling, was the color of a morning glory. Holly, however, loved the fairies. She ran after the humming flocks, following them down hallways, upstairs, into crevices. When one of the larger fairies got stuck in a keyhole, Holly tactfully prodded her out with a stick and told no one. When, in the midst of a 2-day heat, she caught sight of the hiding fairy in the shade of an orange tree in the conservatory, she kept quiet, while Tundra sat next to her with a blanket over his head, the picture of aggrieved dignity. Holly dangled her feet through the stair posts and jeered and cheered at the tumultuous scoring sessions that took place on the chandelier. "Isn't it wonderful?" she cried to the wolf. Tundra grunted. Even Holly found the revels a bit unnerving on occasion. While fairies have tiny voices, 4 or 5 fairies together can barely be heard by human ears, but 700 fairies together, and they make a sound like a herd of elk stampeding over glass. Sophia had to put her foot down on the second day and refused to allow any of them into the schoolroom. So when Holly felt the need for a little peace and quiet, she went there. In the silent room she sat, the snow swirling and swishing around her, casting a lacy veil over the hard edges of the desks and chairs. Holly worked on her clay models, pulling and smoothing faces out of the malleable stuff. Something strange seemed to happen to her when she took the soft clay in her hand. Her mind drifted as her fingers moved nimbly. And when she emerged from her reverie in 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, she looked with amazement at the figure she had created. It was almost always someone she knew, and it was almost always an apt likeness. She looked at the face in her hands. How had she done it? Her mysterious talents certainly did not extend to drawing or painting. Her portrait of Tundra had made Sophia laugh so hard she cried. Perhaps I'm a sculptor, she said to herself late one afternoon, admiring a clay replica of McKenna she had just completed. She could hear the fairy's thin screams somewhere in the palace. It sounded as though they had broken into Viviana's sitting room again. Evriel, said a soft voice in her hair. Involuntarily, Holly reached for her curls and felt the delicate brush of wings against her fingers. Little feet, no heavier than the lightest touch of a falling leaf, pattered along her hand. Holly tried to breathe softly. She had never been so close to a fairy. Cloud not, the little fairy said. Warn wire of me. She glanced in the direction of the shrill shrieks. But you're one of them, rejoined Holly, taking a guess as to the fairy's meaning. She had remembered what Nicholas had once told her about fairy talk. It was not exactly another language, he had said, but a way of talking in pictures. Holly smiled at the tiny, scowling face. It was Emma Milas, the youngest and tiniest bouquet. She perched upon Holly's wrist, her sea-green wings wrapped tightly around her as if to protect her from the noise. Don't you like hide and seek? Asked Holly. Lost and sought over much to a stream, said Emma Milas crossly. Sharp edge, oh knife tongues too. She pulled on her green hair and looked approvingly around the room. Pale world, empty bucket. Yes, Holly agreed. I came here to get away from the fairies, but before I knew it, I had made this. See, it's McKenna. A long way to look down, Emma Milas observed. Holly stared at the little figure. Emma Milas was right. McKenna's face was proud. Yes, I suppose so. But she is a grand fairy. I keep trying to make dolls, pretty dolls for the little girls in the mortal world, but I can't seem to do it. Every time the face turns into someone I know. It shows too much, too. I don't think McKenna would like this face, do you? She looks in the mirrors and her blood sings love. Holly had to think about that one for a moment. You mean she would just see this and love herself? A golden balance. You mean yes? Emma Milas nodded. Your father all clasped in warmth, bags sag with petticoats stiff, heads and lace too, under your hand? Holly could feel her brain twisting and straining to transform this idea into words. Oh, yes! Dolls for my father to deliver on Christmas. Dolls for the children, in lace, like you said. Emma Milas peered into her face and asked lucidly, Why? Holly's shoulders drooped. Because I have to do something, she said quietly. Because you and all your cousins are trapped in the land of the immortals, and it's all my fault. Because I don't deserve to be an immortal. I've never done anything important for the people in the mortal world. Under your hands swirling like paper on their towers, then hard to your shoes. But I can't, Holly burst out. I can't get there. Remember? My father's the only one who can leave. The rest of us just stay here, locked in, until... She couldn't bring herself to say his name. He comes to get me. Emma Milas regarded Holly with bright, searching eyes. Half round in a long night, she said finally, seeming to select her words carefully. Dazzled with whiteness up, your heart goes. How does it go? Asked Holly intently. Sign in a long night, said Emma Milas, clearly exhausted by the effort to make Holly understand. From snow to snow. Then she shook her head. She could speak no more. Holly pulled her soft handkerchief from her pocket and made a little bed for Emma Milas. The fairy crawled toward it, rolled the fabric overhead like a tent, and fell asleep instantly. Holly watched over her until the room grew dark. Holly settled herself more deeply into the nest of cushions she had arranged in her sitting room. Half round, she muttered. She had been racking her brain for hours to find a meaning for the fairy's words. Say the whole thing again, demanded Alexia for the 20th time. She said, half round in a long night, dazzled with whiteness up, your heart goes, recited Holly. That makes no sense at all, sniffed the fox. I think it does, Holly said earnestly. That part about my heart, I think she's trying to tell me that there's a way for me to go to the mortal world and do something important there. I really think that's what she was trying to say. Then she's wrong, Alexia scowled. What about the curse? Tundra looked up at Holly sympathetically. Maybe she was making it up. Fairies are terrible liars, you know. She wasn't making it up. She was trying to help me. I don't know why you just don't ask your father, said Alexia. I told you, said Holly patiently. If I tell him, he'll try to stop me. He doesn't want me to go to the mortal world. I don't want you to either, said Tundra. Holly rubbed between his ears. Oh, hush. She threw back her head and stared at the branches above her. Half round. That's the best clue. What's half round? There was a long silence. All right, what about dazzled with whiteness up? She said. What could that be? Maybe there's half a hole in the bottom of one of the glaciers, and if you fall into it, you'll end up in the mortal world, suggested Hempy. Holly hid a grin that would have hurt his feelings. Maybe you're right. Alexia was not so tactful. The glaciers aren't white, silly, they're colored. Hempy stared at the floor. Now, Lexi, don't be such a crab, said Holly peaceably. Why can't you find Emma Lilas and ask her to explain, suggested Euphemia. Fairies can't explain, replied Tundra. She already did her best. Besides, said Holly, it would take me months to find her again. What about Sophia? Whispered Empy. Won't she help you? Holly sat upright. Sophia, of course. She knows everything. Good thinking, said Tundra. For a penguin, said Alexia. Though Holly knew that Sophia lived in the castle and where her apartments lay in the old wing under the Uther's tower, she had never visited her godmother's rooms before. As she stood the next morning before the carved wooden doors with their brass fittings, she hesitated at this prospect of entering the private chambers. Not that she would be unwelcome, she just wasn't quite sure what she would see. Holly raised her hand to knock, but the wood itself seemed to melt away, and she found herself inside a large, shadowy room, hung with rich tapestries and lit only with flickering candles and brass lamps. On the walls, pictures of princesses, firebirds, and golden horses had been painted in enamel, and from behind a lacy screen, a thick curl of steam spread the scent of tea through the cavernous space. Come in, goddaughter, said Sophia, emerging from behind the screen with her usual serene expression. Would you care for some tea? No thank you, said Holly, unable to take her eyes from the jewel-bright paintings. There was a silence. Are you paying a social call, Holly? Asked Sophia finally. Isn't it rather late in the evening? Shouldn't you be asleep? Holly smiled. It's morning, Sophia. Really? Said Sophia, unperturbed. Really? You would be able to tell if you opened the curtains. Sophia looked at the velvet hanging over the windows. I prefer to make my own time, dear. Now do tell me what I can do for you. She sipped her tea. Holly explained the events of the previous day. When she repeated Emma Lilas's words, Sophia shook her head disapprovingly and exclaimed, Fairies, such a naughty lot. I shall have to speak to McKenna. No, don't do that, pleaded Holly. Emma Lilas was trying to help me. But Holly, she has not helped you in the least, cried Sophia. She's only made you want something you cannot yet have. Emma Lilas has given you a riddle that you are not ready to solve. Holly was near tears. Sophia, you know that the only thing I want is a chance to deserve the immortality I was born with. Please, Sophia, I'm an outsider here, and I can never be anything else until I journey to the mortal world and make my way. Help me. She knelt beside her godmother's sofa. At the sight of Holly's misery, Sophia's face softened. Oh, my dear, let us try again. What you are truly asking me to do is grant your wish, are you not? Yes, said Holly, looking up, hope flashing across her face. Send me to the mortal world, she begged. Sophia sighed. And what will you do when you get there? I don't know, Holly confessed. All I know is that something is drawing me to the Empire City. I know my destiny lies there. I know I will find my heart's work there. That is the truth, Sophia said simply. Then send me. You have magic. You can grant wishes. No. Holly, it is the law of the universe. I cannot grant a wish that is within your power to attain. Holly stared at her godmother. My own power? Yes. You know this? Yes. When? Oh, soon, child. You can find the way, and you must seek it patiently. It will happen soon enough. Sophia stood up abruptly and paced toward one of the covered windows. Holly sat in silence and then lifted her head. I'll be patient, but tell me one more thing, please. Her godmother smiled. What is it? Will I die there? The cloud-colored robes came to an abrupt halt, and Sophia stood as though frozen for a long minute. Then, to Holly's astonishment, her godmother's form was surrounded by a nimbus of electric blue, like that of a flame. Slowly, the robes grew transparent, and Sophia disappeared before Holly's eyes. Chapter 14.